Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Streamtime Sports. I'm your host Nick Meacham and thrilled to be joined by my next guest, and I will get them to join us in just a second. But one thing that really sticks out to me, and I've been following a lot over the last few months over here in Jamaica, is I get a lot of American sports content over here. I get the ESPN Caribbean, which I seem to have on nearly every night, and also a few of the other channels, which are a real mishmash of stuff. And I am always impressed at the breadth and depth of US sports media content. And one of the things that really stands out to me is how on earth someone who lives in the US and is a sports fan can follow so many different leagues and teams. So I thought, what better way to get into that than someone who has been right at the heart and soul of the revolution around sports media and particularly what the big tech platforms are doing with engagement, both from an athlete perspective and indeed from a fan perspective, then Dave Sethi. So Dave, welcome to the Streamtime Sports Podcast. Now, for someone like myself who's come from Australia and lived in a fair bit of time in the UK, you really, in the UK, it's football and a little bit of everything else. Maybe a little bit of cricket seasonally, a little bit of rugby seasonally, or you're just a diehard rugby fan. How are you able to keep across all of the different sports teams, sports leagues that are happening in the US? It seems like it's just relentless.
Yeah, I think I have a convenient excuse of saying that I work in sports, and so I can call time that I'm spending watching or consuming sports content as work, even if it may or may not be the case the entire time. But yeah, I'm still a non-cord cutter. So subscribing to cable, maybe I'm one of the few lunatics that still does that. But subscribing to cable makes it easier for me to peruse, browse, etc. Obviously, social has made access to different sports, and different communities around sports, far easier to find, to discover, etc. And yeah, I mean, we have such a depth of sports in the United States, some unique systems like college athletics, which I know we'll get into. But for me, my origin around being a sports fan and thus cultivating interest in sports was having two immigrant parents who actually, with the help of sports, assimilated into this country and its culture. And I live in the DC area, and sports is really, the fabric of this broader sort of DC area community. A lot of fandom in this area, and so yeah, I found just having a rooting interest is also just sort of part of the culture that I live in day out, and so it's all available to us, right? We just have to know where to find it or look for it, even if we don't actively look for it. And for me, I happen to be one of those people that actually seeks it out, even if it's sports that are pretty niche. So.
Well, it's good that you're seeking it out, but you've definitely been someone who has been really at the heart of, I'd say, a transition within the sports media landscape as social media became such a prominent part of the fabric of what a fan is and how they consume and engage with sports. And one of the reasons I was very keen to have you on is you've been head of sports at Instagram, you've been director of sports partnerships at Meta, you're a Whistle Sports before, YouTube and Google before then in different roles. I mean, over the period of time that you've been at these really impactful businesses to the sports industry, we've been seeing a huge transformation in how sports is consumed and almost like the perception and change of, I guess, how we would have defined what a fan looked like 10, 13 years ago. And now you've moved on to a really interesting role within athletes.org, which we're going to get into in a second. But just could you sort of summarize, like, well, firstly, in the role you had within Instagram in particular and Meta, just what was the role you were trying to play? Because I think one thing I've found, or it's struck me talking to people who've been in similar roles like yours in different social platforms, you have to spend more time almost educating, and you're trying to just get people to get their heads around what it is even that the platform can do for them, more than trying to strike deals and partnerships that perhaps people are hoping in a sports industry that's been built around licensing deals for so long. It's not about that. It's actually about, hey, there's a huge audience here you can tap into. Here's the way to get the most out of the platform. What was the role that you were playing over that time, and particularly at Meta?
Yeah, it's funny because I think partnerships is maybe one of the more ambiguous terms of our industry. It can mean a lot of different things, add a lot of different organizations to a lot of different people. But almost to answer your question about the role, to give you the historian's perspective on where this has gone, and I fondly refer to the fact that, well, social, digital, et cetera, it's one of the fastest moving, fastest evolving maybe devolving industries or verticals that exist. And look no further than, when I was working at YouTube circa 2011 to 13, around there. And so less than a decade ago, the conversations around platforms like a YouTube or, emerging days of Instagram, et cetera, was really trying to highlight the value proposition of the then and now, but also in the future, because it was not a foregone conclusion that brands or athletes or organizations would use these platforms the way that it is now, right? You and I can find our favorite follow on any of these platforms today, but 10 years ago, it was a real conversation around the trade-offs of distributed media, for lack of a better term. To summarize the role that I had as succinctly as I can, really, it was all about being the bridge and connective tissue between the sports industry and its priorities and opportunities and challenges, and the company and its opportunities and priorities and challenges. And for the Instagram slash Meta side, priorities could be called products, whether it's Reels, which we've all heard about, ad nauseum for the past few years, or once upon a time it was IGTV, or maybe it was monetization or safety and well-being tools and products. But understanding the company priorities and socializing and driving those priorities in the sports marketplace, but vice versa, how do you have a real empathy of what the sports industry is going through and what they need out of the platforms, in this case, Instagram and then Meta's portfolio, and trying to be an advocate on behalf of that industry and help be that bridge, as I mentioned before. And it sounds kind of obvious on its face that this is a role that should exist, and that you need to have that sort of connective tissue. But and it would also sort of be a foregone conclusion that sports is a massive priority at a platform. But what you have to keep in mind is that for every person like myself who's raising the banner for sports, there is a person next to me who's doing the same for fashion or for entertainment or for teen creators, et cetera.
Mm.
And so that role became very valuable in building empathy within the walls of Instagram and Meta. And sports, I think, as we both know, is such a catch-all. And so there is no one size fits all in terms of how a platform can serve the needs of the sports industry, because you're talking about media codes, you're talking about leagues, you're talking about athletes. Even within athletes, you're talking about superstars like Lionel Messi or LeBron James, all the way down to a college athlete who's a freshman, and 18 years old. And how do you have an understanding and an empathy around what their needs are and help to prioritize and drive those things at a place as vast as Instagram and Meta overall? So that's how I describe the role at a high level. And the work within each of those sort of segments of sports differs based on who you are and what you need.
So one of the things we really want to talk about today is a lot to do with the athlete economy, the athlete dynamism, the ecosystem around the athlete, I suppose. And particularly to start with, I wanted to use your background to sort of set the scene a bit about that, because I think that's really, really what you've been across, Dave, is like what has led to enabling a new era for athletes to build these media businesses, this ecosystem around themselves, to be able to maximize the value of their brand, their audience, the things they do on and off the field, so to speak. So, but just before we jump into a little bit to how you've seen that evolve, this might be a bit of a weird question, but I'm just curious, in someone that played the role that you did, and you've talked about the fact that there were people playing that role in other verticals as well. Ultimately, what was the measure of success in those instances? Is it because you can say all the nice stuff about we want to help everyone get the most value from the platform, blah blah blah, but what was success measured by? Is it just driving stickiness on and engagement times up on sports related content? You basically just wanted to make the platform more valuable for users, and to do that you had to get more value from the different industries to support that and the interest? Or is it something, and obviously might be a revenue component at some point? How are you measuring success really on all that effort and work you had to do with educating everyone?
Yeah, what's interesting is that at least for some of the partnerships organizations within a tech company and its social platforms, is that, and maybe this is more so news to your audience. than not, but they operate as cost centers, not profit centers. And so I think it's an important distinction to make because there are, partnerships functions at any range of organizations that are really just business development, slash, revenue producing functions or generating functions. For us, really the KPIs focused a bit on sentiment, a lot on adoption or growth of the priorities that our company has laid out, again, whether it is a specific product as an example and helping your segment, your industry understand the product market fit that you're trying to achieve, whether it's sports or entertainment, et cetera. So any number of those. From a programs perspective, I looked at our function as, and it's in a company as vast as Meta or Google, you'd be surprised at how few people can effectively do this. But it's how do you help your company see around corners and actually see what the future looks like in those particular industries and help set them up for success. And as we may touch on with some of my more recent work, the work that I did in the college athletics segment was a perfect example of how do I see what's coming, because as a fan and as an industry person, I have an understanding of it. And how do I bring this company back, along with me so that when there is a moment that occurs or an opportunity that arises, you're ready for that moment. And so certainly KPIs, the most specific ones were around product utilization, platform utilization, and then programs, things along those lines. There was a revenue component to it, but as I mentioned, again, it wasn't a core focus. It was more about how do you enable the rest of the broader company to benefit off of the great content and the great creators of that content who are leveraging platforms like Instagram, Facebook, et cetera.
Mm. At what stage through your time there and even in the companies beforehand did you really, I guess, and this may be you saw it coming a long time before most, but the value and the role the athlete themselves is and can play around building that fandom and those audiences and those followers? Because I think the industry is still coming to terms with it now that actually the power and the impact comes from these athletes, these brands, these people that are people are following athletes more than clubs, more than ever now. It's a definitive shift we're seeing in consumer behavior and fandom. At what point did you have a light bulb moment, or did you see something sort of slowly start to unravel, or were you like, hang on, something big's here is happening? How long ago that journey in those 15 plus years you've been across the sports media tech space did you start to see that?
Yeah, there's it's a little chicken and egg, to be honest, because to your point, the proliferation of social platforms has led to disintermediating the relationship between athletes and fans. So they can essentially, for all intents and purposes, go straight to the consumer. They don't have to rely on somebody holding up a microphone like the one you're sitting behind in order to have their voice be put out into the world. And so that disintermediation has led to really what, as you shared, what availed itself being that fans are very, very interested in being a part of the communities that athletes are building around themselves on these platforms. And so that disintermediation maybe unlocked what type of fandom already existed, but it required that sort of disintermediation in order for that to potentially occur. And as you mentioned, if you look at the biggest stars in a respective sport, they dwarf the amount the size of the communities that are around the sports, at least from a social metrics perspective. But I think that's very telling, and also people want to feel like they're connected to somebody, and it's easier to understand what somebody is about than it is for me to understand what an organization, a media entity, a league is all about. So I think we've seen that growth. But if you even go back to the days, early 2010s, when the first investments in original content were made by social platforms, namely YouTube spending $100 million on original content, those investments were not purely from an organizational perspective. I think the thesis already existed, and of athletes or individuals being resonant with fans and communities, because that was behavior that was unlocked even at the start of these platforms coming to bear, right? It was individuals like you and I that were creating content and distributing content. This notion of YouTubers refers to individuals who committed to YouTube as a creation platform and a distribution and engagement platform. And so I don't know if it was a great sort of epiphany of sorts. I think the platforms and tools unlocked voices that fans, when given the opportunity, wanted to access directly, and athletes have been a big part of it. Obviously, Instagram has been the most resonant platform with athletes, but it's not the only platform that's resonated with athletes, and it just happens to maybe be today the one that suits them best for their needs or the ways in which they want to express themselves.
So before we move into some other aspects, I'm just curious what your, I don't know, we want to call a crystal ball or just lens on the dynamic of social media from an athlete and fandom perspective. Do you see and think that might be, we've gone through such a change over the last 10 years. Do you think it's going to continue to change and evolve, or do you think it's actually now it's about optimizing and refining those relationships through platforms like those now? Or do you just think it's so up for disruption that someone else will pop up next year and then all of a sudden everyone changes approach yet again?
I mean, the innovation, or at least attempted innovation around platforms, hasn't slowed down, even if we haven't necessarily caught on something, maybe since TikTok, maybe, I guess, when it comes to creator or athlete expression and community building, but it's certainly not the last platform that could pop. I mean, we had Clubhouse just a couple of years ago that was a thing until it no
Oh
longer
yeah.
became a thing. Discord's obviously popular from a community's perspective, but I think it continues to evolve to be more sort of creator led or focused. I don't have a crystal ball. I wonder if the scales, move back a little more to the middle when it comes to video versus text or other forms of expression, which means there might be more opportunities depending on what happens with X for that to be, a format that resonates, and maybe platforms that can take advantage of the fact there are still people like myself who might want to read a 300 character tweet as opposed to a 2.5 minute long reel or TikTok video. But I think there's still going to be plenty of innovation, and even innovation from a business model perspective on how individuals can make money off of these platforms, because outside of YouTube, there really has been no other platform. You could even argue X is probably closer to it than the other platforms where individuals and athletes can create sustainable revenue streams. To LeBron James, making ad revenue off of Instagram is never going to matter, but he's not the only athlete using that platform. So yeah, I think there's still plenty of innovation. There are platforms like Grandstand that have been created that are focused on more micro communities and monetization and better margins, et cetera. So I don't think that innovation is going to stop. Maybe a little bit harder to find product market fit today than it was 3 years ago.
Yeah, it definitely seems that the real key to unlocking the value of social media is still going to be just how the e-commerce aspects do develop. It seems that it's taken a lot longer to get up and running because it's clearly more complex than most people think it would be to launch e-commerce style offerings and solutions. But now we are starting to see that really come to life. So we'll allow a lot of athletes to start generating real returns from meaningful audiences they've been building on those platforms, other than having to rely on sponsored endorsement related content. But speaking of sponsored and endorsement related content, it's a nice segue to NIL, name, image, likeness. We've been following that across the world for some time now. It was really quite I don't know if this is a bit hyperbolic, but probably the biggest moment in NCAA in terms of changing the fabric of the college sporting system, probably ever, if not ever, then close to. Just how do you see how that's been playing out? I mean, obviously from outside in, someone who's not based in the US, I've seen a lot of activity going in all different directions. Everyone's in to try and do deals now in different ways to maximize that tiny window. I think sometimes people outside the US don't appreciate that. There's the proportion of college stars that have meaningful audiences and fans and relationships with an audience group is so significant in the US, but actually when you talk about the pros, it's only a small percentage actually get to that level. So just what have you seen that's happened since that decision was made, and where do you think it's at today?
Yeah, a lot of good and a lot of not so good. And for some maybe historical context, Basically, the NCAA instituted a interim NIL policy in summer of July of 2021 that enabled athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness. Which, to take it back to sort of social, it's hey, I got a YouTube channel. I can finally click that monetization button and make ad revenue off of content that I'm creating. Prior to 2021, that opportunity did not exist. You'd be violating policy if you were to do so. So it was a watershed moment for the industry. Ironically, it wasn't the NCAA's preferred decision. They were actually forced by states that were adopting state legislation that would enable college athletes to have these rights. And then, for a need to have some sort of blanket policy that applied to all of its membership, the NCAA created this policy. I have many dear friends at the NCAA, and I have a lot of respect for the organization and what they've done. But this interim policy created a lot of loopholes. So you've got sort of two separate sides of NIL. You have what I would call the spirit of NIL, which is, to use that YouTube example, an college athlete being able to create content, build community, monetize that community the way that influencers, YouTubers, creators have done since the beginning of time, or since monetization programs existed. So you have that spirit of NIL, which is build your brands, engage your audience, this, that, and the other things that they should have been able to do for a long time. Like that was a foregone conclusion. And you have athletes that have really benefited from being able to do that. The Kavner twins are probably two of the poster children of female college athletes who have been able to take advantage of this era. And I think it has also illustrated the value of social platforms in democratizing opportunities and leveling the playing field. So it doesn't matter if you are the number one football recruit in America playing in Alabama, you could be a women's basketball player or a women's hockey player. And if you're good at building audiences and creating engaging content, you have the same opportunities, even if you're not maybe making money through your university. So that's the spirit of NIL. All this other noise is the result of that policy having a lot of loopholes in it. And that's where you have terms like collectives and essentially a dressed up version of pay to play, which has challenged all notions of what it means to be a college athlete and how that's distinct from being a professional athlete. And that notion has been, or assertion has been challenged in court now in the United States. And a lot of roads seem to lead to a college model having to adopt some version of a pro model. So again, I could probably spend the entire hour with you talking about just the comings and goings, but at the end of the day, I think what happened in 2021 was overdue, because really you're talking about athletes building their own platforms and leveraging the opportunity of being a college athlete. And to your point, what might be a small window, because only I'm going to be an NCAA spokesperson. 2% of all college athletes will go pro in the sport that they play in college, right? That's those are hard facts. And so, how do you help them maximize this window, take advantage of the platforms they're playing on, as well as the audiences that they can build, so they can set themselves up for later in life, and after their careers are over. So a lot of good, and frankly, not a lot not a lot of not so good that's occurred, and hopefully there's the cleaning up of it all that's going to happen here in the next couple of years.
So the not so good part. So the good. Obviously, you made a great point, great description of that, and you definitely did a much more articulate job than I did of setting the scene there as to the impact and the value it's bringing. What have been some of the not so good parts, and what do they need to address? Really, are you seeing just deals being done left, right, and centre that aren't really kosher, I suppose, and putting even some of the athletes perhaps at in uncomfortable positions? What are you seeing there?
Two very different not so goods. One being, and I don't want to forget my train of thought, so I'll say both of them now, and then I'll talk about one, and you can remind me if I forget the second. One is just this notion of collectives and pay to play. The first, though, is around the predatory behavior that has existed in taking advantages of athletes who have never had these opportunities, in their lives. And the irony in it is that a lot of the ways in which athletes can monetize their name, image, and likeness and do those things that are going to benefit them economically, they're not new to world. The notion of marketplaces has always existed. The notion of branded or sponsored content, ad revenue, none of these things are necessarily new. The context is entirely new to college athletes who, prior to summer of 2021, were basically ineligible to use half of the social platforms functionality to do the things that we just talked about. What you get and what you got in 2011 when YouTube, I think it was 11 or 12, when they launched their first monetization program, and when branded and sponsored content became a thing and marketplaces became more of a thing, is you get a lot of people that are taking advantage of ignorance. And that's not the fault of creators at that time or YouTubers or now college athletes. It just means that there's a learning curve. And with that learning curve comes some of the horror stories of athletes having been preyed upon by bad actors in our space. I think that stuff gets cleaned up more quickly over time because there will be more awareness, there will be more precedent that's been set, more examples that one can look to. I think that learning curve I think we're on the right path. And there will be more organizations like the one I work for that will verify and highlight the credibility of certain organizations relative to other organizations, that are not behaving above board. The other side, yeah, with the loopholes and with collectives and stuff, and not to diminish collectives, but I think they're an easy sort of scapegoat for what's ailing, college athletics, is that there is basically NIL, but really what it is, it's pay to play. And so it's, hey, I'm signing a deal with a third party that sort of feels affiliated with the university, and they're telling me that I'll make $200,000 if I commit to that school. And I can't actually say that it's contingent upon you playing at my school, but I'm going to put in some stuff in the contract that means you got to show up at a car dealership 3 miles from campus 5 times a year in order to get your money. Oh, and by the way, this organization or entity that you're signing a contract with might not even have the money in their bank to pay you what you're being paid for. It's completely unregulated, other than this industry policing itself, which historically the industry's not done a great job of policing itself, or we wouldn't be in the situations that we're in. And so I view those as being two sides of a coin, two very different sides of a coin. The former, is where I've spent part of my career really enabling and educating and empowering athletes to choose their own adventure in this NIL era. The latter is what I've been focused on more so in my current role at athletes.org, and advocating on behalf of athletes, and frankly, getting hopefully more quickly to a place where this industry, acts and behaves as professionally as the money it makes would indicate. So.
Sadly, I mean, one thing a line I've used for the past 15 years or so since I've been working in sports media is sports has been successful in spite of itself, not because of itself. And I mean by that is that sports as a product is an incredible product that grabs the attention and of fans globally, but it has never been one to do the best it possibly can by making the measures that it needs to practice best practice, let's say. And this is probably an example of what happens inevitably when you have results on the field becoming so important to any organization, not least in a situation like the NCAA, and which I think, Dave, you set it up really nicely to start talking about your current organization, athletes.org. Tell us a bit more about the genesis of the organization and why you joined and what you're focused on.
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to have been here at this organization since maybe late September of last year, but I've known the founder and the CEO for much longer than that period of time. And really, what we are building is the association for college athletes. So think of us similar to the NFL Players Association or the NBPA, and with a couple of key differences. One is we are focused on college athletes. The second is that we are technically not a union because college athletes are technically not employees right now. Whether that changes in the near future or somewhat distant future, roads are pointing, are going in that direction, but there's a lot that could happen between now and then. But we felt we didn't have to wait to create an independent athlete advocacy group for all intents and purposes that can offer many of the same benefits that professional athletes get from their own associations and unions. And Really, there are three things that we focus on as an organization. One is giving these athletes support on and off the court or field. So things like free second medical opinions, because as much as you might trust the team doctor at the university you play for, I think we all know there are some inherent conflicts of interest that may not present every single day, but if we can give an athlete comfort that they have an independent organization providing a resource like a free second medical opinion, that's what we want to be offering our membership. We offer things like free background checks. So to your point, if there's if there are individuals or organizations that want to do business with athletes, they should have the opportunity to vet those businesses from by a third party that has only their interests in mind. We offer access to resources like free like pro bono legal services, so that athletes who again have never had to exercise a degree of acumen around things like signing a contract that has obligations in it, or doing their first NIL deal, or working with a collective, that they have a resource that can help them navigate the legal complexities in those contracts, of which that stuff's confusing to me. And I'm much older than these college athletes, so to have them have access to that is important for us. And then things like financial advisement resources, financial literacy, education, etc. So support is core to what we do, and the value that we want to offer our membership freely. The second, or really it's third, but I'll mention the second, is income. So we haven't focused much on this, but to give you an idea, from at least in terms of the U.S., when you're part of a group, that group can collectively gain income opportunity or potential through things like group licensing. So the most obvious example is EA Sports doing a deal with the NFL and NFLPA to get player likenesses in Madden, right? Or actually the NCAA college football game, which is being released, I think sometime later this year. So there's an income opportunity that being part of a significant membership can provide. And in college, just for context, that's a highly fragmented space right now. And so we think our association can help reduce that fragmentation and unlock more opportunities for college athletes. But then most importantly, what we're focused on as an association is voice. And how do you get athletes' voices into the world? And it sounds obvious on its face, but what you have to understand is that the tradition of college athletics has been the power brokers, that have historically controlled and created the system, basically giving that system to athletes and almost telling them, you should thank us for it, which there are a lot of college athletes who benefit from the current system. There are a lot who are not getting what they deserve. And for us, and again, for context for some of your audience who may not know, we are at maybe the most critical inflection point in the history of college athletics, where a system that's been around for decades is at a crossroads of deciding or determining what the new model looks like going forward. And for us, it is our position, and I hope the position of everybody in college athletics, but I can't make that assumption. But the hope is that people understand that there can be no new model that exists in college athletics without athletes speaking into and co-creating that model. So the days, and this is related to social media, but it's related to more broadly this athlete empowerment era that we're in, that the days of college athletes receiving the system that they're playing in should be over, and they need to participate in the creation of that system, whether it's revenue sharing between certain college athletes on campuses who create economic value for the university, benefiting from the economic value that they are directly creating, or whether it's negotiating standards of benefits that colleges should be affording all of their athletes. And some do a great job of that, but there is no universal standard or benchmark. And so for us, in order for that new system to be created, we want to represent our membership, of whom we have roughly 3,000 now. We want to represent them and bring them to their rightful seat at that table. The way I describe it with where we are in college athletics, everyone needs to get to that table. And that table is round right now, because we don't have to be adversarial. We don't have to make demands at this point. What we want to illustrate is that At this round table, you have the NCAA, you have college athletics administrators, you have university presidents, you have Capitol Hill, you have athletes. Everybody can discuss and participate in the creation of a system that benefits everybody at that table. But it has to have the athlete perspective at that table. And it sounds obvious on its face, but historically in the college athletics industry, that has not been the case, or it's not been the case nearly as much as it needs to be. And so that is truly what our association does and aspires to continue doing, is giving these athletes, bringing their voice onto that stage and making sure it's fully represented and negotiating their interests as an independent athlete advocacy organization.
It sounds like a really important role, and as you pointed out, it's a really important time to have someone playing that role on behalf of the athletes. How has the organisation been met from a reception point of view from, say, other stakeholders in the industry? Obviously, your main focus is, by the sounds of it, NCAA focused by and large. So, has it been well received? Have you found it challenging to get the NCAA really on board to make sure that you're one of the stakeholders around that round table, or has it been positively received?
Mixed bag. And it's a mixed bag because you have different factions within these different stakeholders, some of whom are very progressive minded and they view inevitabilities in the system as well, and they'd rather figure it out as opposed to fighting it. So things like revenue sharing with football players and basketball players, as an example, or again, standards of benefits, health, medical, et cetera. There are certain things that people acknowledge need to be part of the new system, and they want to get there as soon as possible. And that includes the head of the NCAA, the president who joined that organization, I want to say 2 years ago at this point, who have acknowledged that there are inevitabilities in this ecosystem. You also have a faction of individuals that want to preserve or hold on to what the old system, how the old system operated and existed. And what I think is there is a middle ground of preserving the best of the old system while acknowledging and embracing what that new system looks like. And ultimately, I think everybody who's operating in this space is going to view different orgs and individuals with a level of skepticism. And to those who are skeptical of what we're building, I would just offer, number one, it's not as if my opinion matters. The opinion that matters is those of the athletes who are part of our association, of which we have 3,000, and it's my responsibility to bring their opinions and perspectives into the world. One of the most powerful data points or proof points that we have is that, different from the NFL and NFLPA or the NBA and NBPA, no athlete is, I mean, there's really no version of being a pro athlete in those sports or playing in those leagues where you're not part of the association. I know there's technically some ways that cannot be, but by and large, if you play in the NFL, you're part of the NFLPA. In college, there is no default association because of some of the reasons I mentioned to you earlier. So the fact that we have athletes of their own volition deciding that they want athletes.org to represent their interests and offer them this kind of support hopefully speaks volumes to what we're building, who supports us, and most importantly, those people supporting us being the athletes who have decided to join, who have not been forced to, who have had, who can leave at any, at a moment's notice. They are truly deciding to be a part of this, and that has real weight. And I think that's why we have been able to have the success we've had over the past 8 or so months, is because we have a significant amount of membership, and that membership has all made a decision to join us. And they've also then made a decision to not join other associations or organizations that exist as well.
So the focus is mainly NCAA. Are you also playing a role with athletes at the pro level as well, or is there a sort of a priority at the college level at this stage?
We have pro athletes, and actually our CEO is a former NFL player, played in the league for over 10 years. So really keenly understands the athlete perspective. We have supporters in the pros, and we have great relationships with the pro PAs, a couple of whom members who are on our board. And so they've been able to help us navigate some of the landscape because of their expertise and experience. We also have, frankly, athletes at the pro level who want to pay it forward and help these athletes these college athletes, succeed on and off the field, but also after their careers are over. Because as I mentioned, not all these college athletes will have a professional athletic opportunity. And so we've been able to create programs where alumni, let's call them, are affording and creating mentorship and other work opportunities on behalf of the members in our association. There's a really interesting opportunity for us and one that we have begun to capitalize on, which is how do we, even though we are a college athlete association, how do we serve the needs and challenges of high school parents and guardians whose children are playing high school sports, may have opportunities to play in college, but are also facing a lot of questions, about this space that they are, by their own admission, ill-equipped to answer or to understand. So things like recruitment today in college looks a lot different than it did even 3 years ago. So helping navigate that landscape, helping navigate the NIL landscape, just being a resource to parents and guardians, because as we know, they are responsible and wanting to care for their children as they navigate big decisions in their lives. And so we think we can be a great resource to them freely in order to help them understand what's happening so that their child can make a great decision for that's going to impact the rest of their lives.
So I'm conscious that we're almost out of time. So I want to wrap up on a couple of points before we wrap up the show. One of the aspects that I think is obviously interesting, and we touched upon in the first half of this conversation, is the role that the media, social media, etc., can play. What are some of the things that you're talking to your members about from that point of view? Are you telling them to prioritize, trying to maximize this window of opportunity? And one of the things I see from afar, I guess, is that it is quite tricky still for an athlete to really focus on building a successful career in sports and being a sort of a media outlet without proper backing and proper support. Just talk me through what sort of guidance and what sort of work you're doing there to be able to maximize this window of time, which, like you said, 98% of them won't be able to tap into the opportunities at the pro level.
Yeah, it's funny. The narrative is the same as when I was working on behalf of Instagram and Meta, right? Which is, to your point, maximize the window, take advantage of the platforms that you have available to you that you may not have down the road. Understand that college can be not a stepping stone to the rest of your life. It can help set you up, for the rest of your life in terms of building a brand, building a community, et cetera. But above all else, I mentioned this, maybe I used this term earlier, but choose your own adventure, because not every athlete cares about personal branding, cares about NIL, cares about maximizing that window. They might care about 15 different things that have nothing to do with the archetype or template for what it means to be the next Julian Edelman on social media. And so for us, and in my unique role at this organization, or my role at a unique organization, I can advise on those things, but it's also my responsibility to bring experts within our network to help our membership make some of those considerations and figure out what their plan looks like, and what their intentions are frankly. But the reality is that, and this is where I distinguish athletes at large, but even college athletes more specifically, they are so unique relative to other public figures and to other creators or influencers, and that the platforms they have available to them are just larger than other platforms that exist. They're the ones playing on Sundays in the NFL. They're the ones playing Saturdays in the SEC. They're the ones who are in a college football playoff. They're the ones playing during March Madness. And that's one of the great things about that tournament is you get these stories over 3 weeks of darlings who you may not have ever heard of, but seemingly overnight gain hundreds of thousands of followers because they've maximized an opportunity on the court by maximizing it off the court. And we want to make sure that, and with the same thing that I told Olympians back in 2021 on the eve of the Tokyo Olympics, which is prepare to be on that podium. Get your house in order so that when you have the success you think you're going to have and want to have, you can take full advantage of it off the court, off the field, et cetera. And so that narrative has really not changed, frankly, regardless of the fact that I'm sitting on the association side and not on the platform side.
Well, it sounds like, Dave, from what you've described, that you have a pretty major role to play in the industry for the years to come, particularly with the turnover or the new athletes coming in each and every year into college sports. So hopefully over the next few years, you guys can continue to expand your role and impact that you have, and indeed not only with the athletes, but indeed the way the NCAA is constructed and operating from a business perspective, so it can make sure that everyone's getting fair dues out of what the environment and the ecosystem is giving it. But that is all we've got time for today. Dave, thank you so much for joining us and give us a little insight into the world of athletes and what's next.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick. This was a blast.
Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as Sports Pro Nick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Dreamtimers. Until next time.